Someone sat down, measured, carved, and tuned an instrument before humans had permanent shelter, before farming existed anywhere on Earth, possibly before complex spoken language had even fully formed. Here's what should stop you for a second. We will never hear the actual song that came out of that flute. No recording exists. No sheet music. The exact notes are gone forever, lost the moment the sound stopped traveling through that cave air 40,000 years ago. But here's what we can do. We can hold the instrument that made it. We can study caves specifically shaped to carry sound the way a concert hall does. We can look at the last isolated cultures on Earth who never lost their oldest musical traditions. And piece by piece, we can get closer to answering the question than you'd probably expect. What were they actually singing about? Let's start with the evidence you can hold in your hand, because it's more extensive than most people assume. The Hohlefels flute, discovered in that same region of Germany, is carved from the wing bone of a griffin vulture, hollow and lightweight by nature, exactly the kind of material you'd choose if you understood acoustics well enough to want a resonant chamber rather than solid bone. 5 finger holes. Careful, even spacing. Researchers who've studied it closely have found the spacing isn't random. It corresponds to intervals that would produce a usable musical scale. Not just noise, but actual pitched, playable notes an ancient musician could have used to create melody. And it's not alone. Similar bone flutes have been found at multiple other sites across the same general region and time period, meaning this wasn't a single strange genius working in isolation. It was a tradition, multiple instruments, multiple makers, refined over time, passed down as accumulated knowledge the way tool-making or fire-starting techniques were passed down. Someone learned to make these. Someone taught someone else. Beyond flutes, archaeologists have found other likely instruments scattered across ancient sites. Simple percussion, animal hide drums that don't survive the tens of thousands of years but leave behind the wooden or bone frames that would have held the skin taut. Rattles made from shells or small stones sealed inside hollow gourds or bone containers. Even in some interpretations, mammoth bones arranged in patterns that some researchers believe functioned as a kind of ancient percussion set, struck to produce different tones depending on the bone's size and thickness. That interpretation remains debated among archaeologists. And it's worth saying clearly that not every ancient bone arrangement was necessarily musical. But the flutes aren't debated. Those are settled, physical, playable instruments. And their existence alone tells you something enormous about how early humans were spending their time and attention. Now, here's where the story gets genuinely strange, because instruments alone don't fully explain where and how this music was actually performed. In 1988, French researcher Igor Reznikov began systematically testing the acoustic properties of painted Paleolithic caves in France, and what he found changed how archaeologists think about these spaces entirely. He walked through cave systems humming continuously, mapping exactly where sound resonated most strongly, where an unamplified human voice would echo, amplify, and carry with unusual clarity. The results weren't random. The locations with the strongest, most resonant acoustics correlated directly with where the most elaborate cave paintings were found, not loosely. Specifically, chambers with poor acoustics tended to have few or no paintings at all. Chambers where a single note would ring out and hang in the air, sustained and rich, were disproportionately covered in detailed artwork. Reznikov's conclusion was striking. These spaces weren't randomly chosen for their art. They may have been selected, at least in part, because of how they sounded, suggesting that sound, art, and ritual were deeply intertwined in a way that a modern museum-style viewing of these paintings completely misses. Nobody stood silently admiring a painted wall in these caves the way you'd walk through a gallery today. There was very likely sound involved. Chanting, singing, something resonant enough to fill a stone chamber and make the experience feel larger than a single voice. If music existed this early and was performed in spaces this deliberately chosen, the next question becomes unavoidable. What was it actually for? And the honest answer is that it was very likely serving several overlapping purposes at once. Not one single function. The first, and probably the most fundamental, is bonding and coordination. Modern research on group singing has found something genuinely measurable happening in the body when people sing together. Heart rates among group members singing in unison have been shown to synchronize, physically aligning to a shared rhythm. Group singing and chanting have also been linked to the release of oxytocin, the same bonding hormone involved in close physical connection between trusted people. In a small hunter-gatherer group where your literal survival depended on the group functioning as a cohesive unit, on people trusting each other enough to share food, cover each other during a hunt, and defend each other from danger, anything that reliably built that trust and synchrony wasn't a luxury. It was a survival tool as real and practical as a spear or a fire. Music likely also played a coordinating role during actual physical labor and hunting. Anthropologists studying surviving hunter-gatherer societies Groups that maintained largely uninterrupted oral traditions until relatively recently in history have documented work songs, rhythmic vocalizations used to synchronize group movement during tasks like hauling, digging, or coordinated group hunting techniques. A shared rhythm helps a group move as one unit rather than a collection of individuals working against each other's timing, which matters enormously when you're trying to drive an animal toward other hunters waiting in position, or coordinate a task that requires everyone pulling or striking at exactly the same moment. Then there's the function that connects most directly to something we've already established about how ancient humans handled hardship: mourning, grief, loss. Anthropologists studying grief rituals across a wide range of cultures, both ancient and among modern groups that maintained older traditions, have found something remarkably consistent. Loss was rarely processed in silence. It was processed out loud, often specifically through song, through structured vocal expression that gave grief somewhere to go besides staying locked silently inside one person. Funeral laments, specific melodic and rhythmic patterns used specifically for mourning the dead, appear independently across an enormous range of unrelated cultures throughout history. Distinct enough in structure and purpose from everyday songs that researchers can often identify a recorded piece of music as a mourning song purely from its musical characteristics without needing to understand a single word of the language it's sung in. This tells you something important. The impulse to sing grief outward rather than hold it in isn't culturally invented. It shows up again and again independently in groups that never had contact with each other, suggesting it's closer to a built-in human response than a learned cultural tradition passed from one society to another. Beyond bonding, coordination, and mourning, there's the ritual and spiritual function tied closely to those resonant painted caves Reznikov studied. Structured, rhythmic sound, particularly sustained chanting or repetitive rhythmic patterns, has measurable effects on human brainwave activity and can contribute to shifted states of consciousness. The kind of altered, trance-like mental state that shows up consistently across ritual traditions worldwide, from shamanic practices to religious ceremony to modern meditation techniques. It's entirely plausible, and consistent with the archaeological evidence, that music inside those specially chosen resonant caves wasn't simply decorative background sound. It may have been actively used as a tool, deliberately, to help shift a group's collective mental state during significant ritual or spiritual moments. The ancient equivalent of using sound with genuine, intentional purpose rather than casual entertainment. Now, here's where we have to be honest about the limits of what we actually know, because it matters for getting this right rather than just making an entertaining claim. We cannot reconstruct actual ancient melodies. We don't have their scales written down, their rhythms notated, their lyrics preserved in any form. Language itself has changed so completely over tens of thousands of years that even if we somehow recovered actual sung words from that era, we likely couldn't translate or even properly pronounce them using what we know of modern human speech. What we can do is study something almost as revealing: the world's remaining oral tradition-based cultures, groups whose musical traditions were passed down continuously, generation to generation, largely uninterrupted by outside influence for an extraordinarily long time. Ethnomusicologists studying groups like the Hadza in Tanzania, the Pygmy peoples of Central Africa, and various indigenous Australian communities have documented musical traditions strikingly different from the harmonic, chord-based structures that dominate most modern Western music. Many of these traditions rely heavily on complex, interlocking rhythmic patterns, call and response structures where one voice initiates and the group responds, and vocal techniques like the intricate layered yodeling documented among certain Central African forest communities that produce remarkably complex musical textures using only the human voice and no instruments at all. This doesn't prove ancient Paleolithic humans in Europe sang in exactly the same style as any of these specific modern groups, and it would be a mistake to claim that directly. But it does strongly suggest something else, something arguably more interesting. Complex musical structure isn't a byproduct of modern civilization, of orchestras, written notation, or formal music theory developed over the last few centuries. Sophisticated, structurally complex music is something humans were almost certainly capable of, and very likely practicing, long before any of those later developments existed at all. So if we put every piece of this evidence together, the flutes, the acoustically chosen caves, the physiological research on group singing, the cross-cultural consistency of mourning songs, and the musical complexity documented among the world's oldest continuous oral traditions, a reasonably confident picture starts to form. Ancient humans almost certainly sang together often and for real identifiable reasons: to synchronize labor and coordinate hunts, to bond a group tightly enough that its members would risk their own safety for each other, to grieve loss out loud rather than carrying it in isolating silence, to mark ritual and spiritual moments with something more powerful and immersive than words alone could provide. What we'll never have is the melody itself, the specific notes that came out of that vulture bone flute on one particular night, 40,000 years ago, around one particular fire. That's genuinely, permanently lost, and there's something worth sitting with in that fact rather than glossing past it. An enormous, meaningful piece of human history existed entirely in sound. And sound, unlike stone or bone, doesn't fossilize. It doesn't leave a trace once it stops. Every song ever sung before the invention of recording technology is gone the instant the last note fades, preserved nowhere except briefly in the memory of whoever happened to be close enough to hear it. Which means somewhere in the deep, unrecoverable past, actual songs, real melodies with real emotional weight behind them, existed and mattered enormously to the people singing them, and then simply vanished completely, leaving behind only the objects that made them possible. A carved bone, a chamber shaped by chance and choice to carry sound, and the quiet, consistent fact that every human culture ever studied, without exception, found its own way to turn breath and rhythm into something that meant more than either alone. You've probably hummed something today without even thinking about it. A tune stuck in your head, a rhythm tapped out absent-mindedly on a table. That impulse is not new. It's not a modern habit invented by radio or streaming platforms. It's something you inherited, quietly, from every single person in your ancestral line, stretching back tens of thousands of years, all the way back to someone standing in a resonant cave or sitting by a fire in deep winter, lifting a hollow bone to their lips and deciding, for reasons that mattered enormously to them and that will never fully recover, that the moment deserved a sound.